I never planned to speak that day, and if you are listening now, you might think this is just another sad story. But stay with me, because what came next changed everything. For years, silence was my routine, my armor, my survival. I learned how to breathe quietly, how to move softly, how to disappear inside my own home. To the world, I was a lucky woman with a confident husband and a stable life. To myself, I was someone who counted footsteps, measured moods, and memorized the sound of a door closing too hard. Every bruise had a story prepared. Every tear had a lie attached. I became skilled at pretending because pretending felt safer than telling the truth. My husband was not cruel every moment, and that is how it traps you. He could be charming, generous, admired by others. At gatherings, he smiled, joked, and spoke proudly about our marriage. People told me I was fortunate. I nodded because arguing felt dangerous. At home, love had rules. A late meal, a question, a tone he disliked. That was enough. The first time he hit me, he cried. He apologized. He promised it would never happen again. I wanted to believe him because believing him felt easier than imagining escape. Days became years. Apologies became cycles. The beatings were careful, calculated, hidden. Places that would not show. Times when no one would notice. The pain hurt, but the words hurt more. He blamed me for his anger. He told me I provoked him. Slowly, I stopped speaking. Slowly, I stopped thinking out loud. I learned that silence could prevent worse things. Each morning, I promised myself I would leave. Each night, I broke that promise. Fear becomes ordinary when you live with it long enough. I stopped recognizing myself. I avoided mirrors. I avoided friends. I avoided questions. I became smaller so he could feel larger. Even then, it was never enough. I lived waiting for the next explosion, the next apology, the next cycle. And yet, I kept telling myself I could endure it. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was strong. The day everything changed began like any other. A family gathering, unavoidable, loud, full of forced smiles. His parents were there, his siblings, friends who admired him. Food covered the table. Music filled the room. I stood in the bathroom adjusting my clothes, choosing fabric that hid bruises. I told myself to survive the evening, smile, be quiet, go home. But something felt different. I felt empty, not scared, just exhausted deep inside. At dinner, he started with small remarks. Jokes about my cooking, comments about my intelligence. People laughed politely. Each laugh tightened something in my chest. He leaned closer and whispered a threat only I could hear. Calm. Familiar. That whisper broke something inside me. I looked around at the faces watching, eating, laughing. And suddenly I knew that if I stayed silent that night, I would stay silent forever. My heart pounded as I pushed my chair back. The noise cut through the room. Conversations paused. Heads turned. My husband frowned. He told me to sit down. His voice carried a warning. Normally, I would have obeyed. That night, I did not. I stood there shaking, but standing. I said I needed to speak. Nervous slaughter followed. He smiled tightly, trying to control the moment. I told him it was time. The room shifted. People leaned forward. My husband tried to interrupt me. He laughed, called me dramatic. I began to speak anyway, slowly at first, then faster. I spoke about nights of fear, about bruises hidden, about apologies that meant nothing, about learning to stay quiet to survive. The room filled with gasps. Someone dropped a glass. No one stopped me. He stood up suddenly, angry, exposed. He denied everything. He called me unstable. But something unexpected happened. No one defended him. No one laughed. Every eye stayed on me. I realized then that truth, once spoken, has weight. It changes the air. It changes people. And just when I thought the hardest part was over, someone else stood up and spoke, revealing a truth even I did not know. And in that moment, the entire room fell silent because what came next would destroy the life he built. I wish I could tell you the silence ended there, but that was only the beginning. The confession that followed peeled back years of lies, and as names were spoken and memories surfaced, the faces around me changed. Shock turned into realization. Support replaced doubt. My husband's control slipped away with every sentence spoken aloud. And as the room absorbed the truth, I understood something powerful. Speaking did not make me weak. It made me visible. It made me real. Yet even then, I had no idea that the truth would travel far beyond that room, reaching places I never expected, setting events in motion that could not be undone. And just when everyone thought the story had reached its end, something from the past surfaced, forcing a decision that would change all our lives forever. What happened after that confession was not justice, not yet, but a chain reaction. Doors opened, secrets collapsed, allegiances shifted, and I found myself standing at the edge of a choice I never imagined I would have to make. Stay silent again and let the system decide, or take one final step that would expose everything, even if it destroyed the family standing in that room. The silence that followed was heavier than any blow I had ever taken, because everyone knew what I said next would decide who fell, who survived, and whether the truth would finally win. And it began the moment spoken. The silence after my words felt heavier than any blow I had ever received. No one rushed to comfort him. No one told me to calm down. People who had avoided my eyes for years suddenly could not look away. I remember the sound of my own breathing, sharp and uneven, echoing in my ears. My husband stood there, exposed and furious, searching the room for support that never came. He tried to laugh it off again, but his voice cracked. For the first time, he realized he was not in control of the story anymore. Someone asked me quietly if I was telling the truth. I nodded. Another voice followed, then another. Questions filled the air, not accusing, but careful. How long had this been happening? Why hadn't I said anything before? I answered honestly. Fear, shame, hope that things would change. With every answer, the image they had of him began to crumble. His mother looked at him as if she were seeing a stranger. His friends shifted uncomfortably. The mask he wore so confidently slipped, and once it slipped, it could not be put back on. He tried to approach me, lowering his voice, begging me to stop. I stepped back. That small movement said more than words ever could. Someone stood between us instinctively. That moment felt unreal. For years, no one had protected me. Now, without asking, someone did. I felt something inside me loosen, something tight and painful I had carried for too long. I was still afraid, but it was different. This fear did not silence me. It sharpened me. The evening ended in chaos. People left quietly, whispering, avoiding his gaze. His family stayed behind, stunned, unsure of what to say or do. He accused me of destroying him. I did not respond. For once, I did not feel responsible for his actions. When we returned home that night, the house felt different. Smaller. Louder, he paced, ranted, blamed me for humiliating him. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling, waiting for the familiar pattern, the shouting, the apology, the violence. It did not come. Not that night. Instead, something more dangerous appeared. Fear. Not mine. His. He knew the secret was out. He knew people would talk. He knew control was slipping through his fingers. He warned me not to repeat my words. He told me no one would believe me long term. He told me I would regret speaking. I listened quietly, watching him unravel. That was the moment I understood how much power silence had given him and how much power truth was taking away. The days that followed were tense. Calls came in. Family members asked to meet. Some apologized. Some doubted. Some wanted details they had no right to. I learned to say no. Each no felt like a victory. I began to see how deep the damage ran, not just to me, but to everyone who had enabled him by looking away. I was no longer just surviving. I was choosing. One afternoon, his sister came to see me alone. She sat across from me, hands clasped, eyes wet. She told me she had heard things before years ago, but convinced herself it was not her business. She apologized. That apology did not erase the past, but it mattered. It was proof that speaking had opened doors that silence never could. It also frightened me because with truth comes consequences, and consequences never arrive gently. At home, he grew unpredictable, sometimes quiet, sometimes furious, sometimes pleading. He promised therapy. He promised change. I had heard promises before. This time, I did not respond with hope. I responded with caution. I began documenting everything. Dates, words, threats. A part of me knew I was preparing for something bigger, even if I did not yet know what. The night he realized I might actually leave was the night he truly lost control. He accused me of poisoning his family against him. He blocked the door. He demanded I take everything back. My heart raced, but my voice stayed steady. I told him I would not lie anymore. The look in his eyes scared me more than any hit ever had. Not anger, desperation. That was when I understood the danger had changed shape. I spent that night awake, listening, planning. When morning came, I made a decision I should have made years earlier. I reached out for help. Not quietly, not indirectly, clearly. I told my story again, this time to someone trained to listen. Speaking hurt, but it also healed. Each word felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I thought was gone forever. What I did not know was that my decision would trigger a response far beyond my home. Stories resurfaced. Patterns emerged. People connected dots they had ignored for years. And just when I thought I was finally stepping towards safety, something unexpected came to light. Something that would force everyone involved to confront the truth in a way none of us were prepared for. I did not expect the world outside my house to react so quickly. Once I spoke to the authorities, things moved in a way I was not prepared for. Calls came from people I barely knew, people who had heard fragments of my story and wanted to confirm it. Some were supportive, others curious, a few skeptical. Every conversation drained me, but it also reminded me that silence was no longer protecting anyone. My husband noticed the change immediately. He watched me closely, trying to predict my next move, trying to regain ground he had lost. He began changing tactics. Instead of threats, he played the victim. He told anyone who would listen that I was unstable, that I had imagined everything, that stress had made me confused. Hearing those lies hurt more than the beatings ever did, because they were designed to erase my truth. But something had shifted. People asked questions instead of believing him automatically. That alone terrified him. I could see it in the way his hands shook when he spoke, in the way he avoided eye contact. One morning, an unexpected visitor arrived. A woman I had never met stood at my door, nervous, holding her phone tightly. She introduced herself as someone who had known my husband years ago. She hesitated, then told me she had heard what happened and felt she needed to speak. My heart pounded as she described behaviors that sounded painfully familiar. Anger, control, violence hidden behind charm. I realized then that my story was not unique. I was simply the one who finally spoke. Her visit changed everything. It confirmed what I had long suspected, but never wanted to accept. This was not a mistake. This was a pattern. I thanked her, closed the door, and sat down, shaking. For the first time, I felt both validated and terrified. If others came forward, there would be no turning back. My husband sensed that something was happening beyond his control, and his fear grew into something darker. That night, he tried to manipulate me again. He cried, said he would lose everything, said he needed me. He promised change, begged for silence, offered anything. I listened, but I felt detached, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold. When I refused to reassure him, his tone changed instantly. The mask slipped. The anger returned. But this time, I was not alone in the dark. I had witnesses, records, support. And he knew it. The tension in the house became unbearable. Every sound made me jump. Every silence felt dangerous. I began packing small things quietly, preparing for the moment I would leave. I did not announce it. I did not threaten it. I simply prepared. That quiet preparation became my strength. He underestimated it, thinking loud control mattered more than quiet resolve. Then something happened that forced everything into the open. A formal complaint was filed. Papers arrived. Dates were set. The reality he had denied for years stood in front of him, undeniable. He exploded, blaming everyone but himself. His family became divided, some defending him, others distancing themselves. I watched relationships fracture under the weight of truth, and I realized how deeply his behavior had poisoned everything around him. In the middle of this chaos, I found clarity. I stopped asking why he did it. I stopped hoping for apologies. I focused on survival, on healing, on protecting myself. I began therapy, something I once believed I did not deserve. Each session peeled back layers of guilt that were never mine to carry. I learned how deeply abuse reshapes the mind, how it teaches you to doubt your own reality. The day I finally left the house was quiet, no shouting, no confrontation. I took a small bag and walked out, heart racing, hands shaking. He did not stop me. He stood there, frozen, watching control slip away completely. That image stayed with me, not as victory, but as closure. I knew then that whatever came next would be difficult, but it would be honest. What I did not know was that my decision would inspire others to speak, setting off a chain reaction no one could contain. Stories would surface, secrets would unravel, and the truth would reach places I never imagined. And just when it seemed the worst was over, one final revelation emerged, forcing a confrontation that would silence everyone involved once and for all. The days after I left felt unreal, like I was walking through someone else's life. I stayed in a small place that smelled unfamiliar, surrounded by boxes I had packed in silence. At night, I barely slept. Every sound made my heart race. Even in safety, my body had not learned that the danger was over. But something else was happening alongside the fear. Information was spreading, quietly at first, then louder. My story was no longer just mine. Messages began to arrive from people I had never met. Some were short, simple, and heartbreaking. This happened to me too. Others were long, detailed accounts of years spent hiding bruises, swallowing fear, pretending everything was fine. I read every message with shaking hands. Each one felt heavy, but also validating. I realized how many people live in silence because they think no one will believe them. I had thought the same, and yet here they were finding courage because I had spoken. My husband reacted exactly as I feared and expected. He launched a campaign to save himself. He told his family I had manipulated the situation. He claimed I was unstable, that I wanted attention, that I was trying to destroy him. Some believed him. Others did not. The division cut deep. I watched people I once called family choose comfort over truth. It hurt, but it also clarified everything. I stopped hoping they would understand. I focused on protecting myself. One afternoon, I received a call that changed the direction of everything. A legal representative informed me that additional complaints had been filed against my husband. My knees nearly gave out when I heard that. I was not alone. I had never been alone. The pattern I lived through had left scars on others too. Hearing that did not bring relief. It brought grief. For myself, for them, for the years lost to fear. When I told my therapist, she nodded gently and said something that stayed with me. Abuse survives in silence. You broke that silence. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel proud. Not loud pride, quiet pride. The kind that settles deep in your chest and says you survived something that tried to erase you. But truth has a cost. The more that came out, the more aggressive my husband became. He sent messages late at night, apologies mixed with threats, love twisted into blame. I documented everything. Each message felt like proof of who he really was. And still, part of me mourned the man I thought he could be. Healing is not clean. It is layered, conflicting, painful. Then came the confrontation I had been dreading, a meeting arranged by family members who believed this could be resolved privately. I almost refused. Every instinct told me not to go. But another part of me knew I needed to face this, not for them, but for myself. I agreed on one condition. I would not be alone. The room was tense the moment I walked in. My husband sat stiffly, eyes cold, jaw tight. Family members avoided looking directly at me. The conversation began carefully, politely. Words like misunderstanding, stress, forgiveness floated through the air. I listened quietly. Then it was my turn to speak. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I stated facts, dates, events, injuries. Silence followed each sentence. The kind of silence that forces people to confront what they are trying not to see. My husband exploded. He accused me of lying again, of ruining his life, of turning everyone against him. He stood up, shouting, demanding someone stop me. No one did. That moment was everything. Not because they defended me loudly, but because they did not silence me. For the first time, he was the one speaking into emptiness. Something shifted after that meeting. People stopped calling him for explanations. Invitations stopped. Support faded. I watched his world shrink while mine slowly expanded. I began rebuilding small things. Routine, sleep, trust in my own thoughts. I learned how deeply abuse had trained me to doubt myself and how long it would take to undo that damage. The legal process moved forward, slow and heavy. Each step required revisiting memories I wanted to forget. But each step also reminded me why I spoke in the first place. This was no longer just about me. It was about accountability, about making it harder for him to harm someone else in silence. And then, just when I thought the story was settling into a painful but predictable path, I received information that reframed everything. Evidence surfaced that went beyond what I had known, beyond what I had lived. It was something that connected past actions to consequences no one could deny. When I read it, my hands went cold. because this new truth would not just silence him. It would change how everyone remembered him. And as that realization sank in, I understood that the hardest part of my journey was still ahead, because speaking was one thing, but facing what the truth would do to everyone involved was something else entirely. The information I received did not arrive dramatically. No loud announcement. No confrontation. Just a quiet message asking if we could speak. I remember staring at my phone for a long time before responding. Something in my chest told me this was important. When I finally agreed, I had no idea how deeply it would shake everything I thought I understood. We met in a neutral place. Bright. Public. Safe. The person across from me looked nervous, almost apologetic, as if they already knew the weight of what they were about to say. They explained they had come forward because they could no longer stay silent after hearing my story. What they shared connected pieces of my past that had never made sense before, moments I had dismissed, incidents I blamed on myself, patterns I thought were isolated. Suddenly, they formed a clear, disturbing picture. My husband had been reported before, quietly, internally, complaints that never reached courts, never reached families. They had been buried, dismissed, or redirected. He knew how to appear respectable. He knew how to choose people who would doubt themselves before doubting him. Hearing this made me feel sick, not because I was surprised, but because I realized how deliberately everything had been done. My suffering had not been accidental. It had been enabled. As the conversation continued, I felt something strange happen inside me. The guilt I had carried for years began to loosen its grip. Not disappear, but weaken. I was not the first. I would not be the last if this stayed hidden. And for the first time, I understood that speaking had not just saved me. It had disrupted a system of silence that protected him. When I left that meeting, the world looked sharper, louder. I walked for a long time, replaying everything in my mind. I felt anger, grief, and a strange sense of clarity. This was bigger than my marriage, bigger than my family, bigger than my fear. I realized that the story people thought they knew about him was about to change permanently. The legal process took on new weight. Investigations expanded. Questions multiplied. My husband responded with rage. He accused me of conspiring, of exaggerating, of ruining his future. But his words no longer held power over me. Each accusation felt empty because I knew the truth no longer depended on my voice alone. Others had spoken. Evidence existed. Silence had broken in ways he could not control. There were days I felt overwhelmed. Healing is not a straight line. Some mornings I woke up shaking, memories flooding back without warning. Other days I felt strong, almost invincible. I learned to sit with both feelings without judging myself. My therapist reminded me often that strength does not mean the absence of fear. It means moving forward despite it. Friends I had lost years ago began reaching out. Some apologized for not noticing. Others admitted they suspected something was wrong, but did not know how to help. I forgave where I could. I let go where I couldn't. I stopped forcing myself to maintain relationships that required me to shrink again. My life became quieter, but it also became more honest. My husband's world continued to collapse. Work opportunities disappeared. Social circles distanced themselves. The charm that once protected him no longer worked. He tried to reach me through intermediaries, through messages framed as concern, regret, even love. I did not respond. I learned that silence, when chosen freely, can be powerful too. One evening, I sat alone and realized something unexpected. I was no longer waiting for justice to heal me. I was already healing by choosing myself every day. Justice, whatever form it took, would be separate from that process. That realization brought peace I had not felt in years. But peace does not mean the past stops knocking. There were still moments of doubt, moments where I wondered if speaking had been worth the cost. Those doubts faded each time another truth surfaced, each time another voice joined the chorus that refused to be silenced anymore. Then came the development none of us anticipated. Something from years ago resurfaced, something documented, overlooked, and now impossible to ignore. It tied together complaints, patterns, and behavior in a way that left no room for denial. When I was informed, I sat down, heart racing, knowing this would change everything. This was no longer about personal testimony. It was about undeniable evidence. And once it became public, there would be no version of events he could spin to escape it. The silence that followed this revelation was not confusion. It was finality. As I prepared myself for what was coming next, I understood that my journey was entering a new phase, one that would test my strength differently. Speaking had been one battle. Standing firm while the truth took its course would be another. And as the world waited for what would happen next, I knew that the moment I feared for years had arrived. When the evidence became public, the reaction was immediate and unforgiving. What had once been whispered now echoed loudly, impossible to dismiss or soften. People who had defended him grew quiet. Those who doubted me avoided my name altogether. I watched from a distance as the story shifted, no longer framed around accusations or emotions, but around facts that could not be argued away. For the first time, I felt the ground beneath me steady, not because everything was resolved, because the truth was no longer fragile. My husband tried to fight back. He released statements through lawyers, insisting on misunderstandings and false narratives. He spoke about stress, about damaged reputations, about how his life was being unfairly destroyed. What he never spoke about were the details, the dates, the records, the patterns. That silence spoke louder than any defense. I realized then how much effort he had put into shaping his image and how little effort he had ever put into accountability. People began approaching me differently, not with curiosity, not with pity, but with respect. Some asked how I survived. Others asked how I found the courage to speak. I did not feel brave. I felt tired. But I also felt honest, and that honesty changed how I saw myself. I was no longer the woman who endured quietly. I was the woman who refused to disappear. The legal process intensified. Meetings, statements, revisiting memories I wished I could erase. Each retelling took something out of me, but it also gave something back. Control, clarity. I learned to set boundaries, to pause when I needed, to say I could not continue a conversation that felt unsafe. Those small choices rebuilt pieces of myself that had been worn down over years of fear. At the same time, my personal life continued to transform. I rebuilt routines, morning walks, simple meals, quiet evenings where no one monitored my tone or movements. The absence of constant tension felt strange at first, like a silence too loud to ignore. Slowly, it became comforting. Peace does not arrive all at once. It grows cautiously when you allow it space. There were moments of grief that caught me off guard. Grief for the life I imagined. Grief for the woman I was before fear shaped her. Grief for years lost to survival. I allowed myself to feel it without judgment. Healing, I learned, is not about pretending the pain never existed. It is about honoring it without letting it define you forever. My husband's attempts to contact me became less frequent, then stopped entirely. I heard through others that he was isolated, angry, struggling to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. I felt no satisfaction in that knowledge, only distance. He was no longer central to my story. That realization was powerful. One afternoon, I was invited to speak in a small, private setting. Not publicly, not for attention, but for people who needed to hear they were not alone. I hesitated before agreeing. Sharing my story again felt exhausting. But when I saw their faces, I understood why it mattered. Silence thrives when people believe they are alone in their pain. Speaking breaks that illusion. As I spoke, I recognized myself in their expressions. Fear, hope, doubt, strength they did not yet trust. I did not offer solutions. I offered truth. That survival is messy. That courage does not feel heroic. That speaking comes with cost. But silence costs more. When I finished, the room was quiet, not heavy, but thoughtful. That quiet felt different. It felt earned. After that day, something shifted internally. I stopped measuring my progress by outcomes I could not control. Court decisions, public opinion, apologies that might never come. I focused instead on what I could control. My safety, my honesty, my future. I began to imagine a life defined not by what I escaped, but by what I chose next. Still, the past had not released its final hold. A scheduled hearing approached, one that would determine consequences, not just socially, but legally. The weight of it pressed on me in ways I had not anticipated. I prepared myself for disappointment, knowing systems often fail those they are meant to protect. But I also prepared myself for strength, knowing I had already survived the worst. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. Memories surfaced, uninvited moments of doubt, whispered old questions. Was it worth it? Did I go too far? I reminded myself why I spoke. I reminded myself of the people who found courage, because I did. I reminded myself that truth does not need permission to exist. The day arrived quietly. No drama, no spectacle. Just a room where decisions would be made based on evidence, not excuses. I sat there, heart pounding, hands steady. For the first time, I was not afraid of what would be said about me. I was afraid only of how long justice had taken. And as the proceedings began, I understood that regardless of the outcome, my voice had already changed the story. The silence that once protected abuse had been shattered. The world could not unhear what was spoken. And as I waited for what would come next, I knew that the hardest part of my journey was transforming into something else entirely. The hearing did not unfold the way I had imagined during all those sleepless nights. There were no dramatic speeches, no sudden confessions, no moment where everything felt resolved at once. Instead, it moved slowly, methodically, like a machine that had finally been switched on after years of neglect. Names were read, documents were referenced, patterns were explained in careful, neutral language. Listening to my life reduced to facts and timelines was strangely unsettling. It felt distant, almost impersonal, yet it carried a weight I could feel in my chest. My husband sat across the room, avoiding my gaze. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence. The confidence that once filled every space he entered was gone. When his lawyer spoke, it was defensive, cautious, stripped of the charm that used to win people over. I realized then that charm only works when people want to be charmed. When truth is laid bare, charm becomes meaningless. As testimony continued, I noticed something else. The room was listening, truly listening, not interrupting, not minimizing, not shifting blame. That alone felt revolutionary. For years, my words had been dismissed or reshaped to fit someone else's comfort. Now they stood on their own, supported by evidence, echoed by others. I felt exposed, but I also felt grounded. When it was my turn to speak again, my voice surprised me. It did not shake. It did not falter. I spoke calmly, clearly, without embellishment. I described what happened, not to provoke emotion, but to establish truth. Each sentence felt like placing a brick, building something solid where chaos once lived. I was no longer telling a story to be believed. I was stating facts that existed whether anyone accepted them or not. Afterward, there was a pause, a long one, the kind that makes time stretch uncomfortably. I thought of all the moments I had stayed silent to avoid this kind of attention. And yet, sitting there, I realized attention was not the enemy. Silence was. Silence had protected harm. Speaking had exposed it. Outside the room, reactions were mixed. Some people avoided me, unsure of what to say. Others approached quietly, offering words of support that felt genuine, not performative. I accepted what felt real and let the rest pass. I no longer needed universal approval. I needed peace. The days following the hearing were filled with waiting for decisions, waiting for outcomes, waiting for the next step I could not control. Waiting is its own kind of trial. It gives your mind space to wander into doubt, fear, and imagined futures. I learned to anchor myself in routine during that time. Simple things, morning tea, short walks, writing down thoughts instead of letting them spiral. I also reflected deeply on the woman I had been before all of this. The woman who believed endurance was strength. The woman who measured her worth by how much pain she could tolerate. I grieved for her, not with regret, but with compassion. She did what she needed to survive. I honored that even as I moved beyond it. My husband's absence from my life became complete. No messages, no intermediaries, no attempts at reconciliation. That silence felt final. I realized I no longer wondered what he was doing or thinking. He had receded into the background, no longer central to my emotional world. That shift felt like freedom. Then came the decision. It arrived in writing, formal and restrained, yet heavy with consequence. I read it slowly, absorbing each line. Accountability was acknowledged. Responsibility assigned. It was not perfect. Justice rarely is. But it was real. It was something I once believed was impossible. I felt relief, but also sadness. Relief that truth had been recognized. Sadness that it had taken so much suffering to reach that point. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. No celebrations. No dramatic confrontations. Just a sense of closure settling gradually. I allowed myself to feel it fully. Closure does not erase the past. It gives you permission to stop reliving it every day. As time passed, I noticed changes in myself that felt subtle but profound. I laughed more easily. I slept more deeply. I trusted my instincts again. When something felt wrong, I no longer dismissed it. I listened. That alone changed how I moved through the world. I also noticed how my story continued to ripple outward. People reached out months later, sometimes years later, saying they had found the courage to leave, to speak, to set boundaries because they heard what I had shared. Those messages humbled me. I never intended to be an example. I simply refused to disappear. Yet in doing so, I became something I never expected. One evening, sitting alone, I realized something that brought unexpected peace. My life was no longer defined by what had been done to me. It was defined by what I chose next. The abuse was part of my history, not my identity. I was allowed to move forward without carrying its weight every moment. Still, there was one final conversation I knew would come eventually, one that would force me to confront the past in a different way, a request I did not expect from a source I never imagined would reach out. When that message appeared, my heart sank because I knew responding would reopen wounds I had worked hard to heal. I stared at the screen for a long time, weighing silence against honesty once more. And as I considered my response, I realized that the choice I made next would determine not just how this story ended, but how I continued living afterward. The message sat on my screen longer than I expected. I read it once, then again, feeling a familiar tightness in my chest. It was from someone I had not heard from in a very long time. Someone tied to a chapter of my life I believed was finally closed. My husband's mother. Her words were careful, almost formal. She said she wanted to talk, not to argue, not to defend, just to understand. That word lingered with me. Understand. For years, understanding had never been offered. Silence had been easier for everyone else. I debated ignoring it. I had learned the value of protecting my peace, and reopening old doors can undo progress in a single moment. But something told me this was different, not because I owed her anything, but because I owed myself clarity. I agreed to meet, setting clear boundaries. Public place. Limited time, no revisiting denial. If the conversation crossed a line, I would leave. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting stiffly, hands folded, eyes tired. She looked older than I remembered, not softened by time, but worn by it. We exchanged brief greetings and sat in silence for a moment, the air heavy with everything unspoken. She was the first to speak. She apologized, not carefully, not defensively, simply. She said she had ignored signs fuzz for years because acknowledging them would have shattered the image of her son she needed to believe in. Hearing that hurt, but it also confirmed what I had long suspected. She asked why I stayed. The question was not accusatory, but curious. I answered honestly. Fear, hope, conditioning, love twisted into obligation. I explained how abuse rewires your sense of reality, how leaving feels more dangerous than staying until the moment it no longer does. She listened quietly, eyes filling with tears she did not wipe away. That silence felt different from all the others I had known. It was not avoidance. It was reckoning. She admitted her role in enabling him, in defending him, in dismissing my discomfort as misunderstanding. She said she did not expect forgiveness. She said she only wanted to acknowledge the harm. I did not offer absolution. I offered truth. Forgiveness, I explained, is not a requirement for healing. Accountability is. When the conversation ended, I walked away feeling lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because nothing remained unsaid. That meeting marked a turning point I did not anticipate. I stopped waiting for apologies from places that could never provide them. I stopped imagining alternative endings where things turned out differently. I accepted the past fully without trying to rewrite it. Acceptance did not mean approval. It meant release. Life began to settle into something quieter. I returned to things I had once loved but abandoned to survive: reading, music, sitting in silence without fear. I rebuilt my sense of self slowly, intentionally. I learned to trust my reactions again, to listen to discomfort instead of silencing it. That trust became the foundation of my new life. Occasionally, I would hear updates about my husband through distant channels, legal outcomes, consequences, adjustments. I no longer felt the need to track them. His story was no longer intertwined with mine. That separation felt like the final step of freedom. One afternoon, I received a letter from someone who had attended one of the small talks I gave months earlier. They wrote about leaving an abusive relationship, about how hearing my story gave them permission to prioritize their safety. I cried reading it, not from sadness, but from the realization that pain, when spoken, can transform into something meaningful. I never chose to be a symbol, but I chose to be honest. That honesty mattered. As time passed, I noticed something else. My voice changed. Not literally, but in how I used it. I no longer hesitated before speaking. I no longer softened truths to make others comfortable. I spoke with clarity, not aggression, with confidence, not apology. That shift changed every relationship in my life. Still, healing is not linear. There were moments when memories resurfaced unexpectedly. A smell, a sound, a phrase. I learned not to fight those moments. I let them pass through me, reminders of how far I had come. Trauma does not disappear. It integrates. And when integrated with care, it loses its power to control you. Then, unexpectedly, an opportunity presented itself. A chance to formally close this chapter. A decision that would determine how the story was recorded, remembered, and referenced in the future. It was optional. I could walk away entirely, preserve my peace, and let the past remain where it was. Or I could take one final step, ensuring the truth was documented beyond doubt. The weight of that choice pressed on me for days. Both paths had merit. Both carried cost. As I considered what to do, I realized this decision was not about him, or his family, or the system that failed me. It was about who I had become, and whether I trusted that person enough to choose wisely. I knew whatever I decided would shape not just how this story ended, but how I continued living afterward. And as I sat with that realization, I understood that the silence I once feared was no longer my enemy. It was simply another choice, one I could make freely for the first time in my life. The decision did not come to me suddenly. It arrived slowly, after days of quiet thought, after long walks and sleepless nights where I weighed every possible outcome. I had spent so many years having choices taken from me that the freedom to choose now felt overwhelming. Walking away completely would protect my peace. Speaking one last time would protect the truth. Both mattered, but only one felt honest to who I had become. I chose to speak, not loudly, not dramatically, formally, permanently. I agreed to let my full statement become part of the official record. Not for revenge, not for validation, but so the story could never be reshaped, minimized, or forgotten, so that if anyone ever searched for answers, they would find truth instead of rumor. Making that choice felt like placing a final stone on a long, painful path. The process was exhausting. Revisiting details I had tried to lay to rest reopened wounds I thought had healed. But this time, I noticed something different. The memories hurt, but they did not consume me. I was no longer reliving them. I was recounting them. There was distance, strength, perspective. I could feel the difference in how my body reacted, how my voice stayed steady even when my hands trembled. When it was finished, there was no applause, no dramatic reaction, just a quiet acknowledgement. And that was enough. I walked away feeling complete in a way I had never felt before. For the first time, my story existed outside of me, documented clearly, immune to manipulation. I was no longer carrying it alone. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. Ordinary had once been impossible. Now it felt precious. I focused on small joys, morning light through the window, conversations without fear, laughter that came naturally, not as performance. These moments reminded me that healing does not announce itself. It unfolds gently when you allow space for it. People continued to reach out, though less frequently now. Some thanked me. Some shared their own journeys quietly. I listened when I could, rested when I needed. I learned that supporting others does not mean sacrificing yourself. Boundaries became second nature. I no longer felt guilty for protecting my time, my energy, my peace. One day, while organizing old papers, I came across something unexpected. A journal I had kept years ago, hidden in the back of a drawer. I had forgotten it existed. I sat on the floor and opened it slowly. Page after page held words written by a woman who was afraid, hopeful, confused, determined. I barely recognized her, yet I loved her deeply. She survived something unimaginable. She carried me here. Reading those pages brought tears I did not try to stop, not from pain, but from gratitude. I whispered a quiet thank you to the woman I once was for enduring long enough to let me become who I am now. That moment felt like closure more powerful than any legal decision. As time passed, my identity continued to shift. I stopped introducing myself through the lens of what I had escaped. I was no longer the woman who survived abuse. I was simply myself, strong, honest, whole. The past remained part of my story, but it no longer defined the chapters ahead. Occasionally, I would be asked if I regretted speaking, if the cost had been too high. My answer was always the same. Silence nearly destroyed me. Speaking saved me. Even with everything it took, I would make the same choice again. Because truth, once spoken, creates paths you cannot see until you walk them. There was one final ripple I did not expect. A message from someone young, just beginning to question their reality, unsure whether what they were experiencing was bad enough to speak about. I responded carefully, gently, reminding them that pain does not need to reach a certain level to matter. Their safety mattered. Their voice mattered. Sending that message felt like closing a circle I did not know I had opened. Looking back now, I understand that the day I spoke was not the end of my suffering. It was the beginning of my life. Everything after that day flowed from a single decision to stop protecting someone who was harming me and start protecting myself. The world did not collapse when I spoke. It shifted. It made room for truth. It made room for others to breathe, and it made room for me to finally exist without fear. Still, as complete as this chapter felt, I knew one final moment remained. A moment of reflection that would tie everything together, not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity. Because the true end of this story was never about him. It was about who I became after the silence ended. And that final realization came quietly when I least expected it, changing how I saw everything that had happened before. It came to me on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of moment that would have passed unnoticed before everything changed. I was sitting alone, sunlight spilling across the floor, doing nothing remarkable at all. And yet, something inside me settled into place with a calm certainty I had never known. I realized I was no longer waiting for anything. Not justice to feel complete. Not apologies to heal me. Not recognition to validate my pain. I had already arrived at something deeper. For years, my life had been defined by reaction, reacting to moods, reacting to threats, reacting to fear. Even after I spoke, even after everything unraveled, a part of me was still reacting to the aftermath. That afternoon, I understood I no longer needed to do that. I was free to choose my direction without looking over my shoulder. That freedom felt unfamiliar, but it also felt earned. I thought back to the woman I was before I spoke, the one who measured every word, every movement, every breath. She believed survival meant endurance. She believed love required sacrifice. She believed silence was protection. I wished I could reach back through time and sit beside her, tell her what I know now, that her voice mattered long before anyone listened, that she was not weak for staying and not cruel for leaving. She was human. As these thoughts settled, I noticed how differently I moved through the world now. I spoke without rehearsing conversations in my head. I disagreed without fear of retaliation. I laughed without scanning the room for danger. These changes were subtle, but they transformed everything. Peace did not arrive as a grand moment. It arrived quietly, built from small, consistent choices. I also noticed how my relationships had changed. The people who remained in my life were those who respected my boundaries without question. There was no need to explain myself repeatedly, no need to justify my feelings. That simplicity felt luxurious after years of emotional chaos. I learned that love does not require you to disappear. Sometimes memories still surfaced. They always would. Healing does not erase the past. It reframes it. When those memories came, I no longer pushed them away. I acknowledged them, reminded myself that I was safe now, and let them pass. That practice became a form of self-respect I had never known before. I also reflected on how the silence I once feared had changed meaning. Silence was no longer a weapon used against me. It was a space I could choose for rest, reflection, and peace. I learned that there is a difference between being silenced and choosing silence. One steals your power. The other protects it. Occasionally, people still asked about him, about what happened, about how it ended. I answered briefly, without detail, without emotion, not because I was hiding anything, but because I no longer needed to share every part of my story to prove its truth. I had nothing left to defend. One evening, I wrote a letter I never intended to send. Not to him, but to myself. I wrote about everything I survived, everything I learned, everything I reclaimed. When I finished, I folded it carefully and put it away. It felt symbolic, like acknowledging the past while choosing not to live inside it anymore. I began making plans for the future without fear shaping them. Small plans at first, then bigger ones. Dreams I once believed were unrealistic started to feel possible, not because life had become easy, but because I trusted myself to handle whatever came next. The greatest realization of all came quietly, without ceremony. My worth had never been tied to how much pain I could endure. It was never tied to being chosen, tolerated, or forgiven. My worth existed long before anyone tried to diminish it. Understanding that changed how I saw everything that had happened. The abuse was not proof of my weakness. It was proof of his need for control. As this chapter closed, I felt no desire for revenge, no hunger for recognition. I felt gratitude. Gratitude for my resilience. Gratitude for the people who listened. Gratitude for the moment I chose to speak, even when my voice shook. That single decision had reshaped my life in ways I could never have predicted. If there is one truth I carry forward, it is this. Silence may feel safer in the moment, but it slowly erases you. Speaking may feel terrifying, but it brings you back to yourself. I did not speak to destroy anyone. I spoke to survive, and in surviving, I found a life that finally belonged to me. And with that understanding, the story did not end. It simply transformed into something new. A life lived openly, honestly, and without fear. A life where silence no longer ruled and where my voice, once hidden, became my greatest strength. As life moved forward, I noticed something unexpected happening inside me. The anger I thought would stay forever began to soften, not disappear, not excuse what happened, but loosen its grip. I stopped replaying arguments in my head. I stopped imagining different outcomes where I said things sooner or acted differently. Those thoughts had once consumed me. Now they felt distant, like memories from another lifetime. People often think healing means forgetting. It doesn't. Healing means remembering without being pulled back into the pain. I still remembered every detail, every fear. Every night I lay awake, listening for footsteps. But those memories no longer controlled my present. They existed, and I existed beyond them. That distinction mattered more than anything else. I began to notice how my body responded to safety. I could relax my shoulders without thinking. I could sleep through the night. Loud voices no longer sent my heart racing. These changes were quiet, almost invisible, but they were profound. Trauma had lived in my body for years. Releasing it felt like learning how to live again from the inside out. One day, while cleaning out old belongings, I found items I once kept hidden. Clothes chosen to conceal bruises. Notes I had written to myself and then destroyed. Objects tied to survival strategies I no longer needed. I held them for a moment, then let them go. Not with anger, but with gratitude. They had served their purpose. I no longer needed them. My relationships continued to evolve. Some people drifted away naturally. Others stepped closer, offering support without conditions. I learned to recognize the difference between concern and control, between love and obligation. That awareness protected me in ways I had never known before. I no longer explained my boundaries. I lived them. Occasionally, I encountered disbelief. People who had just learned pieces of my story struggled to reconcile it with the version of him they once admired. I understood their confusion. I had lived with that contradiction for years. I no longer felt responsible for resolving it for them. Truth does not require consensus. It exists regardless of who accepts it. There were moments when sadness surfaced unexpectedly. Not sadness for him, but for the time lost. For the version of myself that never had the chance to exist freely. When that grief appeared, I allowed it space. I learned that grief and gratitude can coexist. I could mourn what was taken and still celebrate what I reclaimed. I also noticed how my sense of identity shifted. I no longer introduced myself through my past. I did not lead with survival stories or explanations. I led with who I was now. Someone thoughtful, someone resilient, someone still learning. That felt like progress. At times, I wondered what my life might have looked like if I had spoken sooner. That question no longer haunted me. It felt irrelevant. I spoke when I was ready, when survival turned into possibility. Timing is not weakness. It is part of healing. One evening, I sat quietly and realized something that surprised me. I felt compassion for him, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, compassion. I recognized how broken someone must be to need control so desperately. That realization did not soften the harm he caused, but it freed me from carrying hatred. Hatred ties you to the past. I chose not to stay tied. The silence in my life now felt peaceful, not threatening. It was no longer something imposed on me. It was something I chose. I filled it with music, reflection, rest. Silence became a space where I could hear myself clearly for the first time. As I moved further away from that chapter, I understood something deeply important. Speaking did not fix everything. It did not erase trauma. It did not magically create happiness. What it did was give me ownership of my life again. That ownership was everything. I no longer waited for validation. I no longer feared disbelief. I trusted myself. That trust became the foundation of every decision I made moving forward. It guided me quietly, steadily, without force. And as this part of my journey settled, I knew there was still one final reflection left. One last truth that tied everything together. Not about abuse, not about justice, but about identity. About who I became when I stopped surviving and started living. That realization would shape how I carried this story into the future, not as a burden, but as proof of transformation. There was a time when I believed my story ended the day I spoke, that everything after would simply be recovery, a slow return to something normal. I understand now that speaking was not the ending. It was the doorway. What followed was not a return to who I used to be, but the emergence of someone entirely new. I no longer measured my life by what I endured. I measured it by what I allowed. Peace, respect, choice. These were not luxuries anymore. They were requirements. I learned that love does not demand silence, and loyalty does not ask you to bleed quietly. Anyone who requires your suffering in exchange for their comfort is not offering love. They are offering control. Looking back, I see how carefully my world had been constructed to keep me small. How fear was disguised as concern. How violence was reframed as passion. How silence was sold as maturity. Understanding this did not make me bitter. It made me aware. Awareness is power that cannot be taken once it is claimed. There were moments when I feared I would always be known for what happened to me, that my identity would be trapped inside that chapter forever. But time proved otherwise. People remember your strength longer than they remember your pain. And even if they don't, what matters is how you see yourself when no one is watching. I began to imagine a future without constantly checking for danger. A future where joy did not feel borrowed or temporary. I pursued things I once dismissed as impossible. I said yes without fear. I said no without guilt. My life became quieter, but fuller, simpler, but deeper. The most surprising change was how I related to my own voice. I no longer questioned whether I deserved to speak. I spoke when something mattered. I stayed silent when silence served me. That balance felt like wisdom earned through fire. I trusted myself in ways I never had before. If I could leave one truth behind for anyone listening, it would be this. Silence may keep you alive, but it does not let you live. And speaking does not require perfection, timing, or approval. It only requires honesty. The moment you choose honesty, everything shifts, even if it doesn't look like it at first. I did not speak to be brave. I spoke because I was tired of disappearing. And in choosing not to disappear, I found a life that finally belonged to me, not defined by fear, not shaped by control, but grounded in truth, dignity, and choice. This story does not end with punishment or victory. It ends with freedom. The quiet kind, the kind that lets you breathe deeply for the first time in years, the kind that stays with you long after the noise fades. And that is how the silence truly ended.